Canada is strong when we recognize Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, who remind us of the deep roots from which we grow and underscore the values to which we aspire. And this is one of the many reasons why my first official trip as Prime Minister is here in the Inuit Nunavut.
So that is Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking this week in Nunavut. And all of this talk about Canadian sovereignty has us thinking, what does that all mean for Indigenous sovereignty and for reconciliation? And how have conversations about Canada's nationalism landed with First Nations communities? Well, for more on this, we're joined now by three Indigenous leaders. Corey Wilson is the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council, and she's in studio with us. Hello.
Hello, Steve. Good morning.
Very nice to see you. Val Napoleon is the founding director of the Indigenous Law Research Unit at the University of Victoria. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Oh,
Good
there
morning.
you are. Okay, we got you. Thank you. And Melanie Mark is with us as well. She is the CEO of La Haikwaskak Consulting. Good morning to you, Melanie.
Good morning.
Very good to see you as well. Thank you all for being with us. Melanie, let me ask you first, what goes through your mind when you hear that clip of Prime Minister Carney in Nunavut saying, and he's standing behind a sign that reads, "Defending the North"?
Well, it's nice to see political leaders standing up and standing behind First Nations and starting to use the correct language, that we are the original inhabitants of this land and this country and the stewards of this land and country, and our rights are protected under the Constitution. So it's nice to see a leader using that language. I think what's missing are First Nations alongside a lot of our political leaders at the moment.
And Corey, when we talk about Indigenous sovereignty versus Canadian sovereignty, what goes through your mind when you hear, this talk of Canadian sovereignty? Where does Indigenous sovereignty fit into that?
Well, I mean, Indigenous sovereignty is the original sovereignty. Canada, prior to the existence of Canada, Indigenous people were here existing in very sophisticated systems of governance, culture, community, nationhood. And then contact came, Canada became a country, and we know that it's about sovereignty from a Canadian perspective, is about domination, the right to determine one's own state and what happens in the state. But I think it fails to understand what sovereignty is from an Indigenous perspective. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned. I appreciate the Prime Minister's comments, but what he has to extend it to is to actual understanding and taking the lessons learned from Indigenous people and our continued existence since the beginning on this land and territory that could prove to be useful and supportive of the path forward as we go forward together. But if we don't do it together, it's not going to work.
So when we see threats from the United States then and Canadians talking about, my gosh, Canadian sovereignty, we have to protect it, the irony is not lost on you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's lessons they can learn from us. And sovereignty isn't about ownership and about sole determination. It's about working together and living together and allowing people to be self-determining, but yet at the same time pursuing their own interests and working together to keep this country stronger and not the 51st state of the United States.
And Val, what effect do you think Indigenous sovereignty or restoring Indigenous legal order in Canada, what impact could that have on the current geopolitical debate here, particularly as it relates to the threats we're getting from the United States right now?
I think it would have a profound and powerful effect, because to recognize Indigenous legal orders, that is the way that Indigenous societies manage themselves on every aspect of collective life, is about recognizing Indigenous citizenries and Indigenous citizenship and the ways that we had civil societies and our own forms of democracy. So recognizing that those characteristics on the part of Indigenous peoples means that they're important to Canada, but it also strengthens Canada. Canada is in dire need of its own citizenry rebuilding and its own efforts to ensure that the law, the Canadian law, has meaning and is a coherent legal universe, which right now I think is being very challenged, and in Indigenous legal perspectives, and would strengthen all of Canada.